Some people say peace comes with retirement, that golden years are for rest, for enjoying the fruits of one's life, for slowing down and breathing in what's left of the world without the noise of alarms and deadlines. But for Kevin Marshall, the very day he moved into what was supposed to be his peaceful forever home, he walked straight into a hornet's nest named Karen. The ink on the closing documents had barely dried before she came marching up the driveway. Sunglasses on, clipboard in hand, voice sharp as a blade, and loaded with authority she had given. Herself? She didn't introduce herself as a neighbor. She introduced herself as the president of the Oak Ridge Estates, HOA, and started rattling off rules that Kevin hadn't seen in any handbook. "You'll need to move that trailer by tonight," she barked. "No visible tools on the driveway, no political flags of any kind. And that shrub over there, it's 2 inches over the height limit." Kevin, who had served 30 years in law enforcement and had planned to spend his retirement tending to his garden, fixing up classic motorcycles, and spending time with his grandkids, simply blinked in disbelief. He had just pulled into his own property and hadn't even had the chance to meet a single friendly face. But Karen didn't care. To her, he wasn't a neighbor. He was a new problem to manage. What she didn't know was that Kevin had spent decades navigating bureaucracy. Liars, manipulators, and aggressive personalities. Karen might have scared others, but she had no idea the storm she had just poked. And what started that morning on the driveway would grow into a neighborhood war that exposed corruption, shook a whole community, and ended with the fall of a tyrant. If you believe in standing up to abuse, in calling out corruption, and in watching a bully get exactly what they deserve, then stop what you're doing and subscribe to Sham Stories right now, because what happened next will make your jaw drop. Over the following days, Kevin tried to comply with what seemed reasonable. He moved his motorcycle trailer behind the fence, trimmed the shrub she mentioned, and stacked his garden tools neatly in the garage. But the more he tried to play nice, the more Karen pushed. She began showing up unannounced, often walking around the edge of his property with a tape measure, making marks on her clipboard, mumbling about non-compliance. She issued him a fine for a bird feeder. A bird feeder. Violation of Wildlife Attraction Code, she said. Then came a notice about the wind chime his wife had hung on the porch. Apparently it exceeded the approved noise level during windy conditions. It didn't take long before Kevin began hearing from other neighbors, cautiously, quietly, like people living under occupation. They spoke in whispers, watching their windows, always glancing around before they shared their experiences. One man, Thomas from 3 doors down, had been fined $600 because his garden hose was coiled in the wrong direction. Another, Angela, had her mailbox repainted overnight by HOA volunteers because the original shade of green was visually disruptive. An elderly couple, the Jamesons, had received 3 citations in a single week, one for a hanging plant, one for an excessively decorative doormat, and another because their visiting grandson parked slightly over the line. But Kevin couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was control, obsession. Karen wasn't enforcing community standards. She was ruling through fear, and worse, she was using the HOA as a weapon. At the next board meeting, Kevin decided to attend. He expected a reasonable group of elected homeowners. What he found was a private room in the clubhouse with Karen at the center, flanked by 2 other board members who looked like deer caught in headlights. Karen ran the meeting like a dictator. No questions were allowed until the end. No objections were tolerated. When Kevin raised his hand and began asking about the sudden flurry of violations being sent out, she shut him down with a sharp "that's not on the agenda." When he persisted, she pounded the table and threatened to have him removed for disruption. The other residents in the room exchanged awkward glances, but no one said anything. Afterward, one of the board members, a man named Greg, pulled Kevin aside. "Don't push too hard," he said. "Karen files complaints. Real ones. She called child services on a family last year, said they were endangering their kid because he played in the sprinklers shirtless." Kevin was stunned. "You're kidding?" Greg shook his head. "She's a nightmare. But no one wants to be her next target." That's when Kevin decided he wouldn't just ignore her anymore. He began documenting everything: dates, times, photos of citations, even video of her walking onto his property. He started attending every board meeting, sitting quietly, watching, listening, gathering intel. I spoke to residents one by one, finding out who else had been bullied, who else had received absurd fines, who else had been threatened. And slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Karen had fined people for rule violations that didn't exist. She had rewritten bylaws without board approval. She had hired her cousin as the HOA's landscaping vendor without a vote. And perhaps most shockingly, she had used HOA funds to pay for a security camera system installed not at the community gates, but around her own house. Kevin compiled everything. He created a folder thicker than a phone book filled with evidence: statements, documents, and photos. He knew taking her down wouldn't be easy. Karen had been running the HOA for nearly a decade. She had manipulated elections, intimidated opposition, and controlled the board like puppets. But Kevin had something she didn't: truth, patience, and nothing to lose. He met quietly with a lawyer who specialized in HOA abuse cases. He filed formal complaints with the State Housing Board. When Karen tried to issue him a $1,200 fine for failing to maintain edge border continuity, he sent a cease and desist letter through his attorney. She was rattled, but she didn't back off. Instead, she doubled down. Kevin started getting anonymous notes on his porch. "Watch your back. We don't need troublemakers." His tires were slashed. His mailbox was smashed. Going. And then he got the break he needed. One of the former board secretaries, an older woman named Sandrick, forward. She had moved away a year earlier but still kept records from her time serving under Karen. She had proof of Karen altering board meeting minutes after votes. She had copies of emails where Karen threatened board members into silence. With Sandra's documents added to his file, Kevin had what he needed. He called a meeting not of the board, but of the residents. Quietly, strategically, he invited everyone who had ever complained, been fined, or been bullied. He rented out the local library's community room and laid everything out. People showed up in waves. By the end of the night, more than 70 residents had come through. Kevin passed around his evidence folder. He told his story. And then the floodgates opened. People cried. People raged. People stood up and said, "I thought I was the only one." They weren't. Karen had ruled through silence, through fear, through isolation. But Kevin had broken the wall. The neighborhood wasn't afraid anymore. Karen had no idea that while she sat in her home issuing her next round of warnings, her entire kingdom was preparing to fight back. Kevin didn't waste a second after that first residents' gathering. Because once people had tasted even a drop of resistance against Karen's dictatorship, they were no longer afraid to stand behind it. And suddenly, the lonely war he had been waging became a movement with numbers, voices, and proof. Within days of that meeting, he helped form a neighborhood coalition called the Fair Oaks Alliance. It's made up entirely of homeowners who had suffered under Karen's rule or simply had enough of living in fear of their own HOA. Kevin drafted a mission statement that focused on restoring transparency, protecting homeowner rights, and removing authoritarian control from a system that had been twisted far beyond its purpose. They started knocking on doors. More stories poured in. Mother of 3 had her kids' bikes confiscated by HOA contractors for being left in sight in their own yard. A disabled Vietnam veteran named Henry had been fined weekly for not repainting his fence fast enough despite medical documents proving his physical limitations. Another neighbor, Susan, who had hosted small book club gatherings on her porch, was fined $200 for hosting unauthorized public events. Karen's pattern became painfully clear. Any expression of individuality, culture, community, or warmth was met with punishment. Any minor deviation from her imagined perfect suburb was labeled rebellion, and rebellion was crushed. Team began organizing and scanning documents, creating a digital archive that tracked every suspicious citation, comparing it against the actual HOA bylaws and publicly exposing discrepancies. They printed flyers, built a website, and started a newsletter of their own that was hand-delivered to every mailbox. Unlike Karen's fear-ridden bulletins, theirs was filled with truth, documentation, and unity. Karen responded the only way. She knew how with fury. She doubled citations on vocal residents. She sent cease and desist letters through the HOA lawyer to Kevin's group, claiming defamation. She banned use of the clubhouse for unsanctioned meetings and instructed security patrols to photograph gatherings of more than 4 people. But the harder she pushed, the louder the resistance grew. A resident named Alicia, who had remained silent for years, broke down at one of Kevin's meetings and revealed that Karen had once threatened to call immigration on her husband over a landscaping dispute. Another woman, tearfully clutching her own HOA violation folder, said she'd been too scared to speak up for years because Karen had threatened to have her dog removed for excessive barking even though her dog was deaf. It was no longer a campaign, it was a reckoning. Kevin knew they had momentum, but he also knew that if they didn't act strategically, Karen would manipulate the rules to lock them out. So they did the one thing she hadn't expected. Organized a recall vote. Per the HOA's bylaws, any president could be removed by special election if 60% of homeowners signed a petition. Kevin and the Alliance launched the petition drive. Karen tried to discredit it immediately, calling it an illegal insurrection attempt. But the Alliance had done their homework. They had verified every clause, every condition, every step. Door by door, the petition moved like wildfire. Some homes were hesitant, still fearful of retribution. Others had been silent victims waiting for someone to knock. Kevin's calm, professional demeanor, combined with years of credibility and his refusal to stoop to Karen's level, earned the trust of even the most skeptical neighbors. Within 12 days, they reached 71%. Karen panicked. She tried to have the petition thrown out by citing a technicality in the submission format. When that failed, she tried calling an emergency board meeting to dissolve the HOA entirely. But her authority was already crumbling. At that meeting, for the first time in her reign, dozens of residents showed up and refused to be silenced. Kevin brought a microphone. Alicia brought photographs. Susan read a prepared statement. The crowd applauded. And Karen, red-faced, shaking, slammed her gavel so hard it cracked. She stormed out of the room and didn't return. The election date was set for 3 weeks later. Leading up to it, Karen waged a smear campaign. She sent out letters accusing Kevin of plotting to bankrupt the HOA. She posted false claims online that the Alliance was a militia, planning to erase community standards. She even reported Kevin to the police, accusing him of harassment. The police visited his house once, asked polite questions, looked over his security camera footage, and left with apologies. Meanwhile, more residents volunteered to help the Alliance. Younger couples brought design skills. Retirees with time helped distribute flyers. Lawyers offered advice. Former HOA members came forward with even more damaging evidence proof that Karen had altered minutes, forged board votes, and spent thousands of dollars without authorization. They compiled it all into a community truth report, a binder of horrors from a decade of unchecked power. When election day arrived, the neighborhood was transformed. It wasn't fear that filled the streets anymore, it was energy. People waved from porches. Handwritten signs, decorated yards, it's time. Take back Oak Ridge. No more fear. Polling tents stood outside the clubhouse. Karen showed up early, flanked by her remaining loyalists, but the turnout spoke louder than any of her shrill warnings. Line after line of residents signed in, cast ballots, and shared quiet nods with Kevin and the Alliance. By the end of the day, the results weren't even close. Karen was removed with 78% of the vote. A new board was formed on the spot with Kevin as interim chair. That night, Karen locked herself inside her house. Lights off, curtains drawn. Her HOA presidency was over, but her accountability was just beginning. Kevin and the new board filed formal reports to the state's HOA Compliance Division, attaching every document they had collected: fraud, misuse of funds, harassment, violations of procedural bylaws. The district attorney's office launched an inquiry. Karen was subpoenaed. She tried to hire a lawyer, but her previous HOA-approved attorney refused to represent her. The community turned its attention to rebuilding. Kevin drafted a new charter one that ensured transparency, limited board powers, and guaranteed homeowner voting rights on major issues. Fines were paused, All pending citations were reviewed, and community gatherings returned. Potlucks, porch concerts. Kids riding bikes without fear of being fined for playing too loudly, but even as healing began, a shadow still loomed. Karen hadn't left Oak Ridge. Her house remained, and with it, the tension of her watching eyes behind closed blinds. Kevin knew it wasn't over. People like Karen don't disappear quietly. They regroup. They wait. And then one night, a white envelope appeared on Kevin's doorstep. No return address. Inside was a single printed sheet. You think you've won? This isn't finished. There was no signature, but Kevin didn't need one. The handwriting on the outside, precise, rigid, in all capital letters, was Karen's. Kevin stared at the note in his hand for several minutes, letting its threatening vagueness wash over him, not because he was afraid, but because it confirmed what he already knew: Karen wasn't finished. The letter didn't need exclamation marks or dramatic flair. It was cold, clean, calculated, and typed with the kind of deliberate control that defined her entire time and power. That signature-less message, dropped without a return address, was her way of saying she wasn't going to take defeat quietly. And while the rest of the neighborhood celebrated their newfound freedom with renewed community spirit, Kevin remained. Alert, because people like Karen didn't vanish, they plotted. He didn't react. He didn't mention it publicly. Instead, he handed it over to the local sheriff's department, who filed it under potential harassment, given her legal status under active HOA investigation. And Kevin returned to his mission, which had never just been about removing Karen, but about transforming Oak Ridge into a neighborhood no longer ruled by fear. The new board quickly held its first official meeting, and this time the clubhouse was packed not with silent, anxious residents, but with hopeful, engaged neighbors eager to participate. Kevin introduced the new charter articles, including mandatory budget transparency, biannual elections, and most importantly, a rule that prohibited any future board president from unilaterally passing enforcement codes without a majority homeowner vote. The crowd applauded, and someone even called out, "This is what a real HOA looks like." For the first time in years, Oak Ridge was beginning to feel like a community instead of a compound. But behind those victories, Karen was busy. Kevin didn't know the full extent yet, but within a week of the recall, odd things started happening around the neighborhood. Angela found her backyard security lights smashed one morning. Henry's fence, the one he'd been fined over so many times, was spray-painted with the word LIAR. Another board member's car tires were slashed in the night. It was provable. None of it caught on camera, but every resident knew exactly what was going on. Karen, stripped of her power, was lashing out in the only way left: covert intimidation. Kevin installed extra security cameras on his own home and started rotating patrols with other residents willing to watch out for suspicious activity. Then, a real escalation came. Karen filed a lawsuit. The summons arrived on Kevin's porch, and the headline was as absurd as it was insulting: wrongful removal and defamation of character. She was suing Kevin, the new board, and 3 Alliance members personally, claiming she had been publicly slandered, unfairly removed, and psychologically traumatized. Kevin took the packet straight to their attorney, who laughed bitterly at the pages before turning serious. "She's not going to win this, but it's going to get loud." And loud it did. Karen's lawsuit made the local news. She gave an exclusive interview to a sympathetic online outlet, presenting herself as the victim of a neighborhood coup. "They've turned on me," she said, in footage taken from her garden, where she stood dressed in pale blue like a grieving widow. "All I ever wanted was peace and order. Now I live in fear." The community didn't buy it. But outside viewers, those unaware of the years of abuse, began weighing in online. And trolls filled the Oak Ridge HOA Facebook page, accusing Kevin and the board of being power-hungry anarchists. For weeks, the tension mounted. Kevin received dozens of anonymous emails. Some told him to resign. Some threatened to make him pay. One was just a photo of a noose he shared everything with. Police, the sheriff increased patrols. Karen's house, still wrapped in silence and closed blinds, remained dark and impenetrable. And then came the biggest bombshell of all. Former accountant for the HO, someone who had resigned years earlier after being pressured by Karen, reached out to Kevin's alliance and offered testimony. Her name was Loretta, and she had kept her head down for a long time, afraid that speaking out would destroy her career. But watching Karen's lawsuit play out in the press triggered something. In her, she handed over a USB drive. On it were internal financial documents showing misappropriation of over $38,000 in HOA DUS money that had been reclassified for personal use, landscaping reimbursements, printer leases for Karen's home office, luxury restaurant charges billed as board dinners, and even pet grooming listed as HOA mascot maintenance. Kevin's jaw tightened as he reviewed the files. This wasn't just bullying. This was fraud. They immediately turned the documents over to the State Oversight Office and to the DAS Investigative Unit.
Ow.
Within 10 days, Karen received a second court notice, this time from the state. She was now being investigated for embezzlement. Her lawsuit suddenly lost all bite. Karen stopped appearing publicly. Her online posts ceased. Her house remained quiet, but now several of her bushes were overgrown. The porch lights were burned out, and her mailbox sagged. It was as if the house had become a visual metaphor for what she had lost, an empire with no subjects. But Kevin remained careful. He told the Alliance to stay civil, no retaliation, no gloating. He instructed the board to maintain professionalism. Even when Karen's few remaining defenders still posted venomous comments online, "Let her bury herself," he said in one meeting. "We don't need to push her. The truth is already doing that." But that didn't stop Karen from one final move. Just as the embezzlement charges gained traction, she leaked a private medical file claiming she had been suffering from extreme stress disorder, brought on by sustained emotional abuse from neighbors. Her lawyer presented this to the court as justification for delaying the investigation. Karen was playing the victim card again, but this time she went too far. One of the families she named as her abusers was the Johnsons, whose young son was on the autism spectrum. Karen claimed his frequent meltdowns contributed to her anxiety. That statement, once made public through court filings, caused an outrage that no public spin could contain. National autism advocacy groups responded. Local news stations picked it up. Suddenly, Karen wasn't just facing HOA charges. She had a public relations nightmare. She tried to issue a statement of apology, but it rang hollow. Kevin watched it once, shaking his head as she stumbled over pre-written words, trying to sound remorseful while still blaming miscommunication. The damage was irreversible. The DA's office accelerated the embezzlement inquiry, and the neighborhood rallied around the Johnson family and others who had been named. Kevin led a unity walk through Oak Ridge. Hundreds of residents marched in silence from the community park to the clubhouse, holding signs that read "No More Fear." "We are Oak Ridge, and you don't speak for us." For the first time in the neighborhood's history, unity drowned out control. The lawsuit Karen had filed quietly disappeared. Her lawyer withdrew. Her house went up for sale a month later, though the embezzlement case still lingered. Kevin wasn't interested in revenge. When reporters asked for comment, he simply said, "She was never the problem. The problem was how long we allowed fear to replace fairness." He meant it. Because the truth was, if Karen hadn't tried to bury him under citations, if she hadn't tried to crush him the way she crushed everyone else, the community might never have realized how broken their system had become. And for the first time in years, they had fixed it. When the for sale sign finally went up in front of Karen's house, it didn't trigger celebration or cruel jokes among the neighbors. It triggered a heavy, complicated silence, the kind that follows the fall of someone who had loomed over people's lives for so long, they forgot what it felt like to breathe without permission. For weeks, Kevin noticed how neighbors would walk a little slower when passing her home, how their conversations hushed as they looked at the dying rose bushes, the peeling paint on the porch trim, the drawn curtains that hadn't fluttered in. Months, no one knew if she was still inside. Some said she'd already moved to a sister's place 2 towns over. Others claimed she left in the middle of the night with boxes and a cat. Kevin didn't speculate. He had no interest in chasing ghosts. His focus remained on rebuilding. The Oak Ridge HOA was no longer a reign of rules. It was now a volunteer council with monthly meetings, open books, and rotating leadership. New bylaws prohibited any one person from holding a chair position longer than a year. Every vote required homeowner participation. The community, once tense and divided, had blossomed into something real. Children rode bikes freely again. Porches were decorated with seasonal flair. Neighbors actually talked to one another without watching the windows. Kevin had returned to his garage where he spent peaceful evenings working on his motorcycles, waving at kids walking home from the park. But Karen's departure hadn't been the end. The embezzlement case moved forward. The district attorney filed formal charges after confirming nearly $40,000 in HOA. Funds had been misused under Karen's authority. She was arrested without fanfare. No helicopters, no cameras. Just a short, cold morning where 2 officers rang. The bell presented a warrant and walked her out the front door in silence. A neighbor filmed it through a window and sent it to Kevin, but he never watched it. "Let the law do its work," he had said. Karen was released on bail and awaited trial, but the fallout was already complete. Her name was etched into local memory not as a leader, but as a warning. Her actions had become a case study for new HOA boards across the region. A state-level HOA reform initiative was launched partly due to the Oak Ridge scandal. And Kevin was invited to speak before a homeowners' legal advocacy group to share his community's story. But through all the attention, he kept things simple. He still mowed his own lawn, still dropped off tools to neighbors, still helped the elderly couple across the street carry groceries. When asked if he'd ever run for office or lead another board, he laughed and said, "Once was enough." But something strange happened a few months after the neighborhood began its healing. A letter arrived at Kevin's home. It was handwritten. The return address was a county correctional facility. Inside was a note from Karen. The letter was not an apology. It was a justificational, last grasp at framing herself as misunderstood, scapegoated, betrayed by people she once protected. She claimed her rules were necessary. That order was always hated by the undisciplined. She accused the new board of being soft, of letting the neighborhood sink into chaos. Kevin read it once, folded it back up, and placed it in a file with all the other HOA documents and archive he kept, not out of pettiness, but to remember what could happen when power was allowed to go unchecked. He never responded. But her words lingered in his mind not because they carried weight, but because they showed how little she had changed, even with everything lost. One afternoon, at the next HOA town hall, Kevin stood up to speak not as a leader, but as a neighbor. He talked about how neighborhoods aren't defined by fences or trimmed lawns or matching mailbox heights. They're defined by how people treat one another, how they resolve conflict, how they protect the vulnerable. He warned them to stay vigilant, not paranoid, not afraid, but aware. Because the moment you allow silence to replace accountability, you open the door for someone like Karen to walk back in. The crowd nodded, applauded. Some stood and shook his hand. Kevin sat down without another word, content that he had said everything that needed saying. That night, while locking up his garage, he noticed something different in the air. If it was just the sound of laughter coming from a backyard across the street, or a guitar being played softly somewhere, or maybe just the absence of surveillance, the absence of fear. And that silence, that beautiful, real silence meant everything, asterisk. 6 months passed quietly in Oak Ridge, the kind of quiet that comes not from repression, but from peace. The kind earned after years of tension and watchful eyes finally melt away into the background of everyday life. Kevin found himself, for the first time in years, able to live without bracing for a knock, a citation, a fine, or a confrontation. The neighborhood had changed not just in its bylaws and leadership, but in its very atmosphere. Gardens had become more colorful, families more visible, and laughter more common. People no longer whispered about what they feared but spoke openly about what they loved. New families moved in and were greeted with homemade bread instead of warnings. Old residents who had retreated into silence re-emerged to walk dogs, sit on porches, and chat over fences. Kevin had become something of a symbol in Oak Ridge, though he never asked for the attention. Neighbors often waved and thanked him sometimes, bringing pies or small gifts, telling him how grateful they were that someone had stood up, had refused to be cowed into submission by a system that had been twisted to serve one person's obsession. But he always waved it off, always said the same thing. I just did what anyone should have done. And while that may have been true, the reality was that very few ever had. His refusal to back down in the face of Karen's intimidation didn't just change the leadership of a neighborhood, it changed the culture. No longer were people fined for wind chimes or bird feeders. Children played basketball in driveways without fear. Flags waved proudly, porches were decorated freely, and homes felt like homes again, not checkpoints. Even the HOA council that followed continued the reforms Kevin and his alliance had put into motion, rotating in new voices, ensuring no one ever again could control it alone. But Kevin, always one to anticipate what others might miss, never. Fully relaxed, he knew that power, when left unchecked, always finds new doors to enter. So he quietly trained others, mentored younger homeowners on procedure, transparency, and how to read between the lines of legal language. He made sure everything stayed above board and remained grounded in service, not control. One fall afternoon, as he swept the last of the leaves from his driveway, he saw the sold sign in front of Karen's old house finally come down. A new couple moved, a young woman and her husband, with 2 small boys. They waved. Kevin walked across the street with a smile and introduced himself. There were no warnings, no booklets, no lists, just a handshake and a welcome to the neighborhood. In that moment, as the boys chased each other through the yard and laughter echoed down the street, Kevin realized what they had all won. Not just a legal victory or the removal of a tyrant. They had won back their freedom, their community, and the right to live without fear in the homes they worked so hard to own. And as the sun dipped low behind the trees and the porch lights flickered on across Oak Ridge, Kevin sat on his porch, arms crossed, the hum of a peaceful evening settling around him. What had begun as one man refusing to be pushed had become a revolution of principle, a reminder that silence in the face of abuse is not Passit's surrender. But Oak Ridge had chosen to rise, and Kevin had reminded them how. If this story inspired you, moved you, or reminded you why we must never let power silence truth, then subscribe to Sham Stories right now. We bring you the real, raw battles that people like Kevin fight every day, the ones no one talks about, but everyone should. Hit that subscribe button and be part of a community that believes in justice, courage, and standing up when it matters most. Ask ChatGPT.